We're living certainly in dark and uncertain times. Now, a few years ago, if I'd been talking about these issues, I'd have thought that the major threats, the military threats that we were faced, would be a sort of warfare that we call asymmetric warfare. That is, it would be between states, highly technologically developed states, and insurgent forces, whether they were guerrillas, whether they were civil forces, and so on. And from Vietnam onwards to the whole of the Middle East, that's been the sort of warfare that we've faced, and that's presented particular problems. But what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years is that between them, Trump and Putin and the forces behind them have torn up that rule book. So the painfully negotiated arms control treaties are now being abrogated, and the extent of the military is moving into new areas, including, of course, space, as we've already heard, and we'll hear later on today. And what's happened in this context is one of the oldest and most up till now maintained of those international treaties, that on the prohibition of chemical and biological weapons, has also been steadily eroded. And this has been eroded in two very interesting and important ways. Firstly, despite the surrender by the Syrians of their formal chemical weapons stop, as we know, in asymmetric warfare, they have been using the oldest of the chemical weapons, chlorine, in vast quantities. And I don't think there's any doubt the evidence that the Assad regime, if not any of the other forces involved on the ground, have been using those weapons. But also, we've seen these extraordinary examples of targeted assassination by chemical weapons, notably, of course, the Skripal case, the Salisbury case, in which a so-called class of nerve gas agents were used, the so-called Novichoks. Novichoks have an interesting history. They're supposed to be banned, of course, under the prohibition on chemical weapons use, but they seem to have been developed, if the stories around them are correct, as part of a sort of false flag operation by the United States government, who fed the Russians potentially and forged documents suggesting that the Americans were using and developing Novichoks on the understanding that these were chemically unsynthesizable, and the whole of the Russian chemical weapons effort would be diverted towards creating agents were impossible. Well, Russian chemistry turns out to be better than the Americans thought, so we now have Novichoks, and there is no doubt, of course, that these similar agents are being developed in the United States, probably elsewhere as well. And if we're looking at that history, it's also worth remembering that the prototype of nerve gas agents developed first of all in Germany in 39-45, and then more recently in the V agents developed at Porton in the 1950s, are the basis on which all of these weaponry is involved. Now, beyond the Novichoks, there are new developments going on in what I'm calling both chemical and physical neuro-war. That is the development of techniques for affecting and directly manipulating sort of minds and brains. In this context, it's worth remembering, and I'll talk very briefly about these two classes of agents in a moment, it's worth remembering the scale on which this is now being developed. When 3 years ago in the United States, the President Obama announced a program called BRAIN, which was to develop technologies relevant to brain and neuroscience, and in parallel to a similar program advanced in Europe. A good chunk of the $4.5 billion allocated to the BRAIN program has gone to DARPA. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which has been the spearhead of the development of new military technologies in the United States, ever, I think, since the 1950s in its earlier forms. So what are the classes of agents that we're looking at there? It's not merely lethal agents, lethal new forms of chemical weapons, lethal new forms of genetically engineered toxins, the sort that were used for the targeted assassination in London of a Bulgarian dissident quite a few years ago now. And also, I have no doubt, although they're still in the area of fantasy, the question of whether it's possible to develop genetically engineered so-called ethnic weapons, that is, weapons which actually will target populations, particularly perhaps of a particular skin color, perhaps of particular other biochemical variations that you might find in the DNA. So this sort of weapons research, still on the edge between fantasy and reality, is absolutely there. If you look at the development of the non-lethal agents, the sort of which are normally regarded as riot control agents, a whole host of new developments are taking place. They are agents which either put you on the floor, that is, they knock you out, they're anesthetics or they're consultants, or they're agents which the military calls off-the-rocker agents, that is, agents intended to disorient or to in other ways immobilize a person and enemy forces. The Americans developed these sorts of agents many, many years ago in the 1950s when the technology was not so effective as it is now, and they developed then a chemical called BZ, which was supposed to make the military of the opposing side burst out laughing and falling and throw their weapons on the ground. It didn't work like that, of course, but nonetheless that class of agents is now being investigated in quite considerable detail. So we're looking at disorienting agents, hallucinogens, calmatives, thiopental, sedatives, hypnotics, anxiolytics, all these sorts of drugs and agents are being developed at the moment. And in addition to that as well, and still on the verge between fantasy and reality, an area very close to my own research as it happens, the possible development of chemicals called memory erasers, that it'll block and prevent unfortunate and unwanted memories, particularly useful and planned in the context of the military veterans coming back from the asymmetric wars who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea is with these sorts of agents is that you will be able to erase the memories of the distressing murders and military technologies that they've been involved with. Those are on the, if you like, the chemical side of what's going on. But in addition to that, you have to see neuro wars extending in a far different way, and really very much in collaboration with and in coupling with the development of the drones and the development of IT and autonomous technology. The American military has for a long time been interested in the development of direct brain-computer interfaces, both to help in the analysis for intelligence analysts who can more speedily, therefore, be able to detect and analyze photographic material, but also for so-called warfighters, particularly pilots. And in the context of the pilots as well, already we saw in the various Gulf wars that have taken place over the last decades, the extensive use by the military of two significant drugs, both of which are available for civilian use as well. One is a sleep preventer, modafinil, which is supposed to enable the pilots to stay alert over very long distances and flights. And the second is the attention enhancer Ritalin, which is used extensively to treat kids in school for so-called hyperactive brain disorder, attention deficit. So those chemical agents, coupled with the new neurotechnologies, are beginning to come into play now and as we speak. In addition to that, I think that you can see, if you analyze the sorts of directions that the DARPA funding is going, is extreme interest in the development of areas that we wouldn't have thought of as weapons areas, of cognitive and of social neuroscience. That is attempts to understand thought processes and to manipulate thought processes going on both on your own side, the area of fake news, and of course on your opponent's side as well. And in particular, the development of agents which are highly relevant to interrogation techniques. Ted referred to directed energy source research. There's been a long-term ambition of the military to be able to develop high-energy, directed energy laser technology, low-intensity, low-frequency microwave beams, which are intended to disorient a potential enemy at a distance. And Even the use of high-intensity magnetic fields is being explored in this direction as well. Now, many of these technologies are much more relevant to coercive interrogation techniques, which is how I think that DARPA and the military primarily intends to use them. I mean, maybe with those you can get away with the crude simplicity of waterboarding and find a more sophisticated way of manipulating minds and extracting information from an interrogated enemy. The final thing I would say to remember about this weaponry is a lot of what we're talking about here are what's called dual-use technologies. That is, some of the technologies have civilian purposes. A spin-off have been considerable advances in medical and brain surgery, particularly as a result of the trying to teach the many brain-damaged victims of the improvised explosive devices which have characterized the Iraq War and the Afghan wars. But these technologies, therefore, have considerable civilian impact as well. So when we're beginning to think about arms control techniques and arms control regulatory processes which might be addressed to these weapons, there is a particular problem associated with them which you don't actually see so clearly when you're trying to think about arms control in the context of nuclear weapons, I think, though I could be corrected. I'm about to stop. I'm going to say one other sentence as well. The only area of this sort of research which has so far been protected from military use are biological weapons, directly the use of biological agents, microbiological and viral ones. And this is, though we can discuss it if you like later, because I think they're unpredictably in their effect. They're not regarded as very effective military weapons. It won't stop people trying to use them, though, I suspect, particularly in the asymmetric wars.